So lesson 3.4, solving by factoring. You should actually be familiar with factoring. You started it in 8th grade and did it in 9th grade. So whenever that was for you, this should be relatively familiar. Factoring is something we come back to over and over again in math. Unfortunately, it might be for you, but hopefully this will be a pretty quick refresher and you'll remember this and it'll be fine. Okay, so when we are factoring, ax squared plus bx plus c when a is 1. So when a is 1, that means that some other steps that might be necessary when a is not 1 really aren't necessary here. And we'll go over the other steps in the next section. So for these, remember, we're going to break this down into 2 sets of parentheses, basically, that have been multiplied together. So you're going to write your 2 sets of parentheses with plenty of space. And then we're going to find some things to fill them in. So what multiplies by itself to give you x squared? Well, that's x. So in the front of each set of parentheses, you write an x. That takes care of the x squared term. So now the other 2 terms, the end of the parentheses, are going to be filled in by 2 numbers that multiply to c, so the last term, and add to b, the middle term. All right, and sometimes this just takes some trial and error. You may be able to see the numbers right offhand and figure them out, and it might take some trial and error of working different numbers out. But the one thing you want to be careful of is signs, just a thing to remind you of. If, for example, it's x squared plus bx plus c, and the c is positive, then your 2 numbers will both be positive, since they're multiplying to make a positive number. And then whatever the middle sign is, if it's plus or minus, you'll just have 2 of that sign since the last term is positive. Remember, 2 positives multiply to make a positive, and 2 negatives multiply to make a positive. So it'll make more sense in examples, but just remember, if the c term is positive, then your 2 numbers will have the same sign, whatever the middle sign is. If c is negative, then you're going to have to, basically your 2 numbers are going to subtract to make the b. Because when you multiply 2 numbers and get a negative result, a negative c, one must be negative and one must be positive, and you'll figure the sign out by giving the bigger term the middle sign. So let's try some of these. So example 1, factor x squared plus 6x plus 5. Just a reminder that you are looking for numbers that multiply to 5, to the last number, and then add to 6. So resist the urge to use 2 and 3, because that would be backwards here. We want to multiply to 5. So make your parentheses, put x in the front, and I need 2 numbers that multiply to 5 and add to 6. Well, that would be 5 and 1. So in your parentheses, you put plus 5 and plus 1 after the x's. And it doesn't matter, you can put the 1 first and the 5 second. It would be the same thing since they're both positive. Okay, example 2, x squared minus 7x plus 12. Okay, again, the plus 12 means I'm going to have the same sign for both of my terms. And since it's a negative 7, they're both going to be negative. So we know it's going to be x minus and x minus. Now let's just figure out the numbers. So what 2 numbers multiply to 12 and add to 7? We've already decided they'll both be negative, but they still need to add to 7. That would be 3 and 4. So in our parentheses, we're going to put our 3 and our 4 that are going to be negative. And again, you could do x minus 3 and then x minus 4, or switch the order and put the 4 first. It's the same. Okay, example 3. This one, we have a negative c term, negative 16. So this is where we want to be careful, because one of our numbers is going to have a positive sign. One of our numbers will have a negative sign. It's the only way to get a negative product. So we need 2 numbers that multiply to 16, and actually, since their signs are different, they subtract to 6. So 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and subtract to 6, that would be 8 and 2. Okay? And 8 and 2, you want to give the bigger number, in this case 8, the middle sign. So since the middle sign is negative, we want the 8 to be negative and the 2 to be positive. So your parentheses should be x plus 2 and x minus 8. You could put the factors in a different order again, but make sure the 8 has the negative and the 2 has the positive. And then example 4, we need two numbers that multiply to negative 24, so different signs, and add to 5. So we could use, for 24, we could use 12 and 2, we could use 6 and 4, but remember, our numbers have to, in this case, subtract to positive 5 because we have 1 plus and 1 minus. So two numbers that subtract to 5, that would be 8 and 3. And remember, you're going to give the middle sign, which is positive here, to the bigger number, 8. So it'll be x plus 8 and then x minus 3. And that's how you factor that one. So that's a refresher of how to do it when the numbers look like this. The next thing on your notes is what we're going to do if you see perfect squares. There are some specific patterns that we use when perfect squares are present. If you have what we call a difference of squares, meaning a perfect square minus a perfect square that only works for a minus, then that would factor as the square root of the first term plus the square root of the second term times the square root of the first term minus the square root of the second term. So basically, you take the square root of the first term, put it in the front, take the square root of the second term, put it in the back, and then one of your parentheses will be positive and one will be negative. Because that middle term is not there, it canceled out, having the plus minus takes care of that. For trinomial, meaning 3 terms, with perfect squares on the end, if you notice that there are perfect squares on the end and the middle term is twice the product of those, and we'll see some examples in a minute of what these do look like, then you're actually going to have the same thing squared times itself. Okay? If it's plus, you'll just take the square root of the first term plus the square root of the last term, and the whole thing is squared. If the middle term is negative, but you've got all the perfect squares in the same scenario, then it's the square root of the first term minus the square root of the second term, all squared. Again, that works only if you have a perfect square in the front and the back, and the middle is double the product of those. If you're concerned with these and you're not sure you're going to be able to notice them, they will still factor the original way. You're just going to end up with two of the same thing. When you factored it, you'll end up writing, you'll write a plus b times a plus b, and you might then notice that that would just be the same thing as a plus b all squared. And either one of those is fine. To either write it squared or write it twice, you should in fact know that those are the same in case you saw either one on a multiple choice test. So let's take a look at some of these perfect square examples. Okay, example 5, factor x squared minus 49. Notice two terms that are perfect squares and being subtracted. The same problem with a plus sign, we actually just wouldn't be able to factor at all. But because this is two perfect squares being subtracted, we can factor this, and it's just the square root of the first term, so x and x in the front of both of our parentheses, and the square root of the last term is 7, so 7 goes in the back, and then one of our signs is plus, and one is minus. It does not matter which goes first or which goes second, as long as you get both the first, both the plus and the minus. All right, that's all you have to do for that one. That's it. For example 6, factor 9x squared minus 64. 9x squared is a perfect square, so is 64. So when we make our parentheses, the square root of 9x squared would be 3x. And the second one would be 3x as well in the front. And then the square root of 64 is 8. So you put an 8 at the end of both parentheses, and then 1 is plus and 1 is minus. All right, so 3x plus 8 and 3x minus 8. Again, it doesn't matter which one goes first, the plus or the minus, as long as you get them both. In example 7, we have one of the trinomials here. Notice x squared is a perfect square. 16 is a perfect square. And so the square root of 16 would be 4. So if we did x in the front of the parentheses and 4 at the back of the parentheses, since the middle term is negative, if I take x minus 4, the entire quantity, and square it, I'll get x squared minus 4x plus 16. If you're not sure with these, you can FOIL them back out. And if you did x minus 4 times x minus 4, and multiplied that back out, when you FOIL, you're going to get x squared minus 4x minus another 4x plus 16. And when you combine those negative 4x's in the middle, that's where that negative x comes from. So that's why we can just do parentheses x minus 4, parentheses all squared. So let's use the same thing for example 8. 4x squared, perfect square, plus 20x plus 25, perfect square. All right, so make your parentheses. The square root of 4x squared would be 2x, so that goes in the front. The square root of 25 would be 5, so that goes in the back. And this middle sign is positive, so we would make a plus sign in the middle, and 2x plus 5 all squared is our final answer. So now just try the problems on the back of the worksheet using these examples to help you. And if you'll hang on to the worksheet, we will go over it Monday and then turn it in. Good luck.